Some moments in life arrive quietly, without warning, and yet they divide everything into two parts: the life that existed before and the life that follows after. Late one night in 2008, a man sat alone in a hospital waiting room staring at the second hand of a wall clock as it moved slowly around the dial. The room was silent except for the soft sound of footsteps passing through distant hallways and the occasional voice of nurses speaking behind closed doors. That man's name was David Lawson, a 48-year-old truck driver who had spent most of his life believing that if he worked hard enough and stayed loyal to the people he loved, everything would somehow remain steady. Only a few hours earlier, he had been on the road finishing another long shift behind the wheel of his truck, thinking about the simple routine waiting for him at home. But then his phone rang, and the voice on the other end of the line spoke words he would never forget. Within seconds, the quiet rhythm of his life began to collapse. The call came from a police officer who spoke carefully, choosing each word with the kind of caution that immediately tells someone the news will not be easy to hear. The officer explained that David's daughter, Emily Lawson, had been involved in a serious accident outside town. The details were unclear, but the situation was urgent. David listened in disbelief, repeating the same question again and again as if hoping the answer might somehow change if he asked it differently. Was she going to be okay? Was she awake? Could he speak with her? The officer's voice remained calm but offered few answers, only instructions to come to the hospital as quickly as possible. By the time David arrived at the emergency entrance, the night had grown colder and the waiting room was nearly empty. He sat down beneath the fluorescent lights with his hands folded together, staring toward the hallway where doctors moved quietly between rooms. Minutes passed that felt much longer than they should have, and eventually a doctor stepped through the doors and began walking toward him. Before we continue and uncover how this night unfolded into a story that would change more lives than anyone expected, take a moment to join the conversation with people watching from around the world. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the events that began in that hospital waiting room would soon transform David Lawson's life in ways he could never have imagined during the quiet drive to the hospital that night. When the doctor finally reached him, the expression on his face revealed the seriousness of the situation even before a single word was spoken. David stood up slowly, bracing himself for an explanation he feared might confirm the worst possibilities racing through his mind. In that moment, the future he had always assumed would continue normally suddenly felt uncertain. What happened during the next few hours would mark the beginning of a story that people in that Tennessee town would talk about for years afterward. It was a story built around grief, regret, and a moment of loss that no parent ever expects to face. Yet it would also become something more complicated than tragedy alone, because the events that followed the accident involving Emily Lawson would eventually lead David Lawson to a decision that few people believed possible when the news first reached the community. At the time, however, none of that seemed visible to the man standing in the hospital corridor listening to a doctor explain what had happened on a dark rural road earlier that night. For David Lawson, the only thing that existed in that moment was the realization that life had changed forever. And yet the story that began with that phone call would not end where most tragedies do. The town where David Lawson lived was the kind of place people often describe as quiet and steady, a community tucked among the rolling hills of Tennessee where daily life moved at a predictable pace. Families had lived there for generations, and most residents recognized each other at the grocery store, the gas station, or the small diners that lined the main road. It was a place where neighbors waved from their porches in the evening and where news traveled quickly whenever something unusual happened. For decades, the town had maintained a reputation for being peaceful, the kind of environment where people believed serious tragedy was something that happened somewhere else. The routines of everyday life rarely changed. Trucks rolled out before sunrise toward nearby highways. Students filled the local high school every morning, and families gathered on weekends to watch football or share meals together. It was a town built around familiarity, the kind of community where people trusted that tomorrow would look very much like today. For David Lawson, that sense of routine had shaped nearly every part of his life. At 48 years old, he had spent most of his adulthood working as a long-haul truck driver, a job that required long hours behind the wheel and days away from home at a time. The work was demanding, but it allowed him to support the family he had built over 2 decades of marriage. His wife had been by his side through the long stretches when he was traveling across state lines, and together they had raised their only child, Emily Lawson, a teenager who had grown into the center of David's world. People who knew the family often described David as quiet, but deeply devoted to the people he loved. Whenever he returned home from a long trip on the road, he tried to make up for lost time by taking Emily to dinner, helping with her school projects, or simply sitting together in the living room talking about her day. To David, life felt simple and meaningful. Work hard, take care of your family, and appreciate the small moments that filled the spaces in between. But on one night in 2008, that familiar rhythm was interrupted in a way that no one in the Lawson family could have prepared for. The phone call that reached David while he was finishing his route did more than deliver frightening news about an accident involving his daughter. It opened a chain of events that would ripple through the entire community. In the days that followed, people throughout the town began asking the same questions that investigators and friends quietly repeated to each other. What exactly happened on that rural road the night Emily Lawson left the house to meet friends? How could one decision made by a group of teenagers turn into a tragedy that would shatter a family that had always seemed so steady? And why do people who remember this story still describe it in the same way years later, calling it both heartbreaking and unforgettable at the same time? The answers to those questions would slowly emerge as the details of that night became clearer. Yet what made this story different from many others was not only the loss that followed the accident. It was the unexpected path that unfolded afterward, a path that would eventually lead David Lawson to confront emotions most people spend their lives trying to avoid. Because sometimes the worst moment a person experiences becomes the moment that forces them to see life in a completely different way. For David Lawson, the tragedy that began on that quiet Tennessee road would ultimately lead him toward a choice that few people in the town believed anyone could make under such circumstances. And that choice would transform a story that began with heartbreak into something no one expected. To understand how that single phone call would eventually change everything for David Lawson, it helps to look at the life he had spent years building before that night. David had never been the kind of man who looked for attention or excitement. His days were defined by routine and responsibility, the kind of steady rhythm that comes from years of working the same demanding job. As a long-haul truck driver, he often spent weeks traveling highways across several states, delivering cargo that kept businesses moving while he quietly returned home between routes. The job required patience and endurance, but David had always believed it was worth the sacrifice because it allowed him to support the people who mattered most to him. Friends and neighbors often described him as dependable, a man who rarely complained and who approached life with the simple belief that providing for his family was the most important thing he could do. When David spoke about the future, he rarely mentioned his own ambitions. Instead, he talked about the hopes he had for his daughter and the life he wanted her to have. That daughter, Emily Lawson, was the center of David's world. At 16 years old, Emily had already developed a personality that combined curiosity with quiet determination. She was known at school for her creativity, especially her love of photography. Teachers remembered seeing her walking through town with a camera slung over her shoulder, capturing images of everyday scenes that other people barely noticed. Old barns outside town, the reflection of sunset on the river, or the simple expressions of friends during casual moments all became subjects for her photographs. David loved looking through the pictures she brought home, often asking questions about what had inspired her to take each one. Despite the long hours he spent on the road, he tried to remain involved in every part of her life, calling home whenever possible to ask about school and listening carefully as she told him stories about the small events that filled her days. Their relationship had grown into something many parents and teenagers struggle to maintain, a genuine closeness built on trust and shared conversations. The Lawson household was busy but full of affection. David's work schedule meant he missed many ordinary moments that other families experienced together. There were evenings when dinner had already ended by the time his truck rolled into town, and weekends when he had to leave again before sunrise. But whenever he returned home, he made a deliberate effort to reconnect with his family. Sometimes that meant taking Emily out for late-night milkshakes at the diner on the edge of town or driving through the countryside while she talked about school, friends, and the photographs she hoped to capture next. Neighbors who knew the family often described them as loving but constantly balancing the demands of work and school like so many other households in the community. From the outside, their lives seemed stable and familiar, shaped by the same routines shared by families across small towns throughout the country. Yet in the months before the accident, small changes had begun appearing in Emily's life that most people did not fully recognize at the time. Friends later said she had been dealing with pressures common among teenagers, but difficult for parents to see clearly. School assignments had become more demanding, and she had started spending time with a new group of friends who introduced her to experiences that were different from the quiet hobbies she once preferred. None of those changes appeared alarming on the surface. Like many teenagers her age, Emily seemed to be exploring independence while trying to understand where she fit among her peers. Looking back later, a few friends would remember moments when she seemed overwhelmed or uncertain, but at the time those feelings were easily dismissed as the ordinary struggles of growing up. For David Lawson, nothing about his daughter's behavior suggested that anything serious was wrong. He believed the challenges she faced were temporary, the kind of obstacles every teenager eventually learns to navigate. That belief would remain unshaken until the moment a late-night phone call arrived and shattered the quiet certainty he had always trusted. The evening that would change the Lawson family forever began like many ordinary nights before it. The house was quiet, the kind of calm that settles in after a long day when everyone is trying to unwind. But beneath that calm, tension had begun to build between Emily Lawson and her parents. Like many teenagers navigating the complicated emotions of growing up, Emily had recently been pushing for more independence. That night, the conversation turned into an argument about where she planned to go and who she intended to meet. David Lawson, exhausted from work and worried about the changes he had noticed in his daughter's behavior over the past few weeks, tried to set limits he believed were meant to protect her. Emily, frustrated and determined to prove she could make her own decisions, insisted she was only meeting friends for a short time. Eventually, the argument ended the way many family disagreements do. Emily grabbed her phone, stepped outside, and said she would be back later that evening. At the time, no one in the Lawson household believed that moment would become their final memory of a normal night together. Emily told her parents she was heading to meet a few friends, something she had done before without incident. The town was small and familiar, and most teenagers her age spent evenings moving between the same handful of places. David watched from the doorway as she walked toward the street and disappeared into the darkness beyond the porch light. The argument still lingered in his mind, but he assumed the tension would fade the next time they talked. Like many parents, he believed there would be another opportunity to explain his concerns and remind her how much he cared about her safety. But the minutes that followed would quietly begin shifting the course of the night in ways no one inside the house could see. Emily never arrived at the place where she told her friends she would meet them. Several hours passed before the call reached David Lawson while he was finishing work on the road. The voice on the phone belonged to a police officer who spoke carefully, explaining that Emily had been involved in a serious accident outside town. The officer's words were measured, offering only the information necessary to bring David to the hospital as quickly as possible. Details about the crash were still unclear, but the situation was described as critical. David listened in disbelief, trying to process how a simple evening with friends could suddenly become an emergency. The long drive to the hospital felt longer than any highway route he had traveled during his years as a truck driver. Every mile seemed to stretch further as he imagined what might have happened on the road where the accident occurred. By the time he reached the hospital entrance, the night air felt colder than before, and the quiet building ahead seemed to carry the weight of the news he had just received. Inside the emergency department, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. Doctors and nurses moved quickly through the hallways, while David waited for someone to explain what had happened to his daughter. Eventually, a physician stepped forward and began describing the injuries Emily Lawson had suffered in the crash. The details were difficult to absorb. The accident had caused severe trauma, and despite the efforts of emergency teams working to stabilize her condition, the situation remained uncertain. David and his family waited through long hours that blurred together as doctors moved between rooms providing updates that never seemed clear enough to answer the questions racing through their minds. Hope rose and fell with every passing minute as they searched the faces of medical staff for reassurance that Emily would recover. But the night continued moving forward without delivering the news they were desperate to hear. Despite every attempt by the hospital team to save her, the injuries Emily Lawson suffered that night proved too severe. The moment when doctors finally confirmed that she had not survived arrived quietly, spoken in words that no parent ever expects to hear. For David Lawson, the realization felt impossible to accept at first. Only hours earlier, he had been planning his next drive home, thinking about ordinary conversations and the small routines that defined family life. Now he stood in a hospital corridor facing the reality that those routines had ended without warning. The shock of the loss moved through the family like a sudden storm, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than anything they had ever experienced. And for David Lawson, the pain that followed that night would soon begin shaping the months and years ahead in ways that nearly destroyed him. In the days following the accident, the quiet town that had always felt familiar to the Lawson family began filling with questions. News of Emily Lawson's death spread quickly through the community, and people who had known her from school, church, and neighborhood gatherings struggled to understand how such a tragedy could have happened on a road many of them had driven countless times. For investigators, the first priority was determining exactly what had taken place during the hours before the crash. Officers began reviewing phone records, speaking with witnesses, and examining the damaged vehicle that had been recovered from the rural road outside town. Every detail mattered. Who had been driving the car that night? Why had the vehicle been traveling so fast along a narrow road, known for sharp turns and poor lighting? And was anything else involved that might explain how a group of teenagers ended up in such a dangerous situation so late in the evening? Those questions became the starting point for an investigation that slowly revealed the truth behind the accident. As detectives gathered statements from the teenagers who had been inside the vehicle, the sequence of events gradually became clearer. Emily Lawson had not been alone when she left the house that night. She had been riding with several friends, teenagers who had decided to take a drive through the countryside after meeting earlier in the evening. The road where the crash occurred stretched through a quiet area surrounded by fields and trees, a place where drivers often felt comfortable traveling faster than they should. According to the reports investigators compiled later, the driver lost control of the vehicle while attempting to navigate a curve at high speed. The car veered off the road and struck a ditch before overturning. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the impact had already caused devastating injuries. When the investigation concluded, officers determined that the crash was the result of reckless driving combined with the inexperience common among teenage drivers. For the Lawson family, however, the explanation did little to soften the reality of what had happened. For David Lawson, the months that followed felt like an endless stretch of time defined by silence and absence. The house that once echoed with Emily's laughter and music now seemed painfully quiet. The camera she carried everywhere sat untouched on a shelf in her bedroom, and photographs she had taken during happier days became reminders of moments that could never return. David tried to continue his routine at first, returning to the truck routes that had always provided structure to his life. But the long hours alone on the road began to feel unbearable. Every mile seemed to give his thoughts more space to replay the final conversation he had with Emily on the night she left the house. Eventually, the weight of that grief became too heavy to ignore. David stopped accepting driving assignments and withdrew from the routines that had once defined his days. Friends reached out with offers of support, but he often avoided their calls, unsure how to explain the emptiness that now filled his life. Grief has a way of reshaping a person's world, and for David Lawson, it slowly became the center of everything he experienced. Weeks turned into months, and the routines that once gave him purpose seemed to fade into the background. He rarely left the house except for necessary errands, and even those short trips often felt exhausting. Conversations with neighbors became brief and awkward, as people struggled to find words that could ease the loss he carried with him. The man who once spent his days traveling across highways now found himself sitting quietly in the same rooms where Emily had once moved freely, remembering the conversations they shared and the plans he had imagined for her future. It was a period of life defined by sorrow and reflection, a time when David believed the rest of his story might be shaped entirely by what had been taken from him that night. But years later, when the memory of the accident had settled into something quieter, yet still deeply painful, an unexpected message would arrive that forced David Lawson to confront emotions he had tried for so long to avoid. Years passed after the accident that took Emily Lawson's life, and during that time David Lawson slowly learned how to exist in a world that no longer resembled the one he once knew. The grief never disappeared, but it settled into a quiet presence that followed him through his daily routines. Then one afternoon, something unexpected arrived in his mailbox. Among the usual letters and advertisements was an envelope with handwriting he did not recognize. At first, David almost ignored it, assuming it was another piece of ordinary mail. But something about the careful way the address had been written caught his attention. When he opened the envelope, he discovered a letter that immediately made his hands tremble. The message came from the young man who had been driving the car on the night of the accident that ended Emily's life. The letter was long and carefully written, filled with words that carried the weight of years spent living with regret. In the letter, the young man explained that he had struggled for a long time to find the courage to write. Since the night of the crash, he had carried a sense of responsibility that had followed him through every part of his life. He described how the memory of the accident returned whenever he closed his eyes at night, and how the thought of Emily Lawson had never truly left his mind. He wrote about the moment when the car lost control on that dark rural road, and the instant realization that his choices had consequences far greater than he had ever imagined. The letter did not try to excuse what had happened. Instead, it was filled with an apology that seemed almost impossible to express fully in words. At the end of the message, the young man asked a question that David Lawson was not prepared to answer. He asked if David would be willing to meet him in person. At first, David Lawson placed the letter aside without responding. The idea of sitting face to face with the person connected to the accident felt overwhelming. For years he had carried anger alongside his grief, emotions that often surfaced whenever he thought about the night Emily left the house. Meeting the driver meant confronting memories he had spent a long time trying to manage quietly. Days passed as he considered what to do. Part of him wanted to ignore the request completely, believing that reopening those wounds would only bring more pain. But another part of him felt a quiet curiosity about the young man who had written the letter. Eventually, after many days of reflection, David made a decision that surprised even some of the people closest to him. He agreed to meet. The meeting took place in a quiet room where both men sat across from each other for the first time since the accident. The young driver looked older than David expected, but the nervous expression on his face revealed how difficult the moment was for him. When he finally began speaking, his voice carried the same regret that filled the letter. He apologized repeatedly, explaining that the events of that night had shaped every decision he made afterward. He described how he had tried to rebuild his life while constantly remembering the consequences of his actions. Listening to those words forced David Lawson to confront emotions he had buried for years. For the first time since Emily's death, he began to recognize something he had not fully understood before. The anger he had carried toward the driver had kept him trapped in the same painful moment, preventing him from moving forward. And as the conversation continued, David Lawson realized that the path toward healing might require a choice he had never imagined he could make. For a long time, David Lawson believed that anger was the only thing keeping him connected to the memory of Emily Lawson. After the accident, grief had filled every part of his life, but beneath that grief lived a quiet resentment toward the young driver who had been behind the wheel that night. It was an emotion that felt justified, even necessary, because it gave his pain somewhere to exist. Yet as David sat across from the young man who had written the letter, listening to the trembling voice describing years of guilt and regret, something inside him began to shift in a way he had never expected. The person sitting across from him was not the careless teenager David had imagined for so long. He was someone who had been living with the weight of that night every day, carrying a memory that had shaped his future just as deeply as it had shaped David's own life. In that moment, David realized something difficult but powerful. Holding on to anger had not brought Emily back, and it had not eased the grief that followed him through every day since the accident. Instead of rejecting the apology, David Lawson made a decision that surprised even himself. After listening quietly for several minutes, he told the young man that he forgave him. The words did not come easily, and they did not erase the tragedy that had taken Emily's life. But speaking them created a space for something David had not felt in years. For the first time since the accident, the weight of bitterness that had been pressing on his life began to loosen its hold. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting what had happened, nor did it mean pretending the loss no longer mattered. Emily's absence remained part of David's world in ways that would never change. Yet the act of forgiving allowed him to see the situation differently, not as a moment frozen forever in anger, but as a painful chapter that could still lead to something meaningful. Over time, that realization began to guide David Lawson toward a new purpose he had never imagined during the darkest months after Emily's death. As people in the community heard about the meeting and the decision he had made, some began asking him to speak about the experience. At first, David was hesitant, unsure whether he could find the right words to describe something so personal. But eventually he agreed to share his story with small groups at local events and gatherings. Standing in front of those audiences, he explained how grief had nearly destroyed his sense of direction after the accident. He spoke about the anger that had kept him trapped in the past, and the moment when he realized that forgiveness could offer a different path forward. His message was not about forgetting tragedy, but about recognizing that pain does not have to define a person forever. David Lawson often ended those conversations by telling people that life sometimes presents moments capable of breaking a person completely. But those same moments can also change the way someone sees the world, allowing them to rebuild meaning in ways they never expected. Years later, the quiet Tennessee road where the accident happened still looks almost unchanged. The same narrow stretch of pavement winds through the trees, and during the day it appears no different from the countless rural roads that cross the countryside. Cars pass through occasionally, unaware that the place they are driving across once became the center of a moment that altered several lives forever. For David Lawson, however, that road will always carry a different meaning. It represents the night when everything he believed about the future collapsed, the night when the life he built around his daughter Emily Lawson was suddenly taken away. The tragedy that began there left a scar that will never fully disappear. Yet it also became the place where the story that followed eventually found a different kind of ending, one that few people in that town believed possible when the accident first happened. This story began with heartbreak. It began with a father sitting in a hospital waiting room, hearing the news no parent is ever prepared to receive. It began with grief that seemed impossible to carry and with questions that had no comforting answers. But the years that followed revealed something unexpected about the way people respond to tragedy. Pain can remain a permanent part of a person's life, yet it does not always define the direction that life must take. When David Lawson chose to forgive the young man involved in the accident, he did not erase the memory of Emily or the sorrow that followed her loss. What he did instead was allow himself to step forward into a future that was no longer controlled entirely by anger. That decision turned a story that could have ended only with bitterness into something far more powerful. So the question now becomes one that reaches beyond this single story. If you had been standing in David Lawson's place, carrying the weight of the same loss and the same unanswered questions, would you have found the strength to make the same decision? Would forgiveness have felt possible after experiencing a moment that shattered your world so completely, or would the pain have been too great to overcome? Stories like this remind us that every person responds to tragedy differently, and there are no simple answers when grief becomes part of someone's life. But hearing perspectives from others can sometimes reveal ways of understanding these moments that we might not see alone. Let me know what you think in the comments. Your perspective may help someone else reflect on the meaning of forgiveness, loss, and the choices people make after experiencing the hardest moments of their lives. And if you enjoy powerful true stories like this one, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next documentary exploring real experiences where tragedy, redemption, and second chances reveal how a single moment can change everything.